My name is Lena Cross, and I was 19 years old when I discovered my parents had rewritten my entire future. My university acceptance letter, the one I earned, was never mailed. Instead, they forged a withdrawal statement, photocopied my transcripts, and handed my spot to my younger sister. They told me I wasn't ready. I believed them for 10 years. Then I walked into a deposition room in Washington and found her sitting at the defense table, assigned to my first case as her supervising attorney. She hadn't expected me either. What she didn't understand was that I'd spent the last decade reading the documents they'd tried to bury. I'm a federal prosecutor now. My sister, she's a defense attorney. The same university she stole from me got her a law degree, a network, and a career. The same parents who forged my signature sat in the front row at her graduation. What they didn't know was that I'd kept every paper: the withdrawal form with my forged name, the transcript manipulation, the guidance counselor's memo that was never supposed to see daylight. 10 years of silence buys you time to build a case. And when that deposition notice landed on my desk with her name on it, I knew exactly where to start looking. This isn't a story about forgiveness. It's about evidence. I grew up in a house where the word fair was used like currency, spent freely on my sister, hoarded when I reached for it. Catherine was 2 years younger, softer spoken, easier to manage. Our parents, Richard and Margaret Cross, ran a small accounting firm out of our basement. They worked long hours, prided themselves on being practical people. Practical meant predictable. Catherine got piano lessons. I got told to practice quietly so she could concentrate. Catherine got a car at 16. I got told the bus was character building. Catherine got her choice of colleges. I got a form letter my junior year saying my early admission to Georgetown had been rescinded due to irregular documentation. I didn't understand that word then. Irregular. It sounds like a typo, a misplaced comma. It isn't. Irregular means someone tampered with your file. Means someone submitted a withdrawal form with your signature on it, a signature you never made. Means someone photocopied your transcript and changed your GPA. Means someone contacted the admissions office pretending to be you and said you were withdrawing your application. That someone was my mother. She used the office fax machine in our basement. She had access to my social security number, my birthday, my handwritten notes, my email password. She forged my name on the withdrawal letter and added a note. Decided to take a gap year, very sorry for the inconvenience. Then she took my acceptance packet, hid it in a file cabinet labeled Tax Records 2009, and never mentioned it again. I found out 6 years later. I was 25, working as a paralegal in Chicago, saving for law school, when I called Georgetown to ask about re-enrolling. The registrar told me I had voluntarily withdrawn in March of my junior year. That was the first time I had ever heard those words. I hung up, walked to the bathroom, and threw up. Then I drove 12 hours to my parents' house, walked past my father reading the paper, opened the file cabinet marked Tax Records, and found the acceptance letter, the forged withdrawal form, and a handwritten note from my mother to the admissions office that said, "Please disregard any future contact from my daughter. She is not in a stable state of mind." I did not confront them that night. I took the documents. I drove back to Chicago. I called a lawyer who specialized in educational fraud. He told me the statute of limitations had likely expired on any criminal case, 5 years for forgery in that jurisdiction. I had waited too long, but he also told me something else. There was no statute of limitations on the truth, and there was no law against building a career strong enough to make that truth matter. So I did exactly that. I finished law school at night. I passed the bar on my first try. I applied to every federal prosecutor's office in the country. 18 rejections, 1 offer, Washington, D.C., the same city where my sister had graduated from Georgetown Law, the university she attended using the spot she took from me. Catherine had become a defense attorney. She worked for a firm that represented corporations, executives, people with money. She was good at it. She had the confidence of someone who had never been told she wasn't ready. Our parents paid for her wedding. They bought her a house. They visited her in D.C. twice a year and never once asked if I lived there too. I did not block them. I did not cut them off. I simply stopped calling, and they never noticed. 3 years I built cases against fraudsters. I learned every trick: forged signatures, fabricated transcripts, straw donors, fake athletic profiles. I studied the Varsity Blues investigation, how the FBI caught parents paying $25 million to get their kids into elite schools. I memorized the details. 750 families, 33 parents charged. The architect, Rick Singer, sentenced to 3.5 years. The forfeiture of over $10 million. I read every court filing. I watched every sentencing hearing, because I knew that one day I would be sitting on the other side of that table. I just didn't know my sister would be there too. The case landed on my desk in January. A pharmaceutical executive accused of bribing doctors. White collar, complex, high pressure. The defense firm was one of the most aggressive in the city. The lead attorney assigned was Catherine Cross. I read her name on the filing and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not sadness. Certainty. This was not a coincidence. This was the case I had been waiting for. The deposition was scheduled for March 15th. 2 weeks before that date, I pulled the file I had kept since that night in my parents' basement. The forged withdrawal letter. The transcript with my GPA changed from 3.8 to 2.9. The handwritten note from my mother calling me unstable. And one more document I had discovered only last year, a letter from Catherine to our mother, dated 3 months after I was denied admission. It said, "Thanks for handling that thing with Georgetown. I knew you'd take care of it. Tell Lena I said hi if she ever comes home." I had kept that letter in a sealed envelope for 11 months. Now I had a deposition room, a federal case, and the legal authority to produce evidence. On March 15th, I walked into the room at 8 in the morning. I wore a dark suit, no jewelry, no expression. The defense table was already set. Catherine was sitting there, flipping through her notes, looking like she owned the building. She looked up when I entered. Her face went through 3 phases in 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, then a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said, "Lena, wow, what are you doing here?" I sat down across from her. I opened my file. I said, "I'm the lead prosecutor on this case, Catherine, and I have a few questions for your client. But first, I need to ask you something about a withdrawal form from 2009. The court reporter looked up. The defense co-counsel stopped typing. Catherine's smile froze. She said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I slid the forged document across the table. I said, "Then let me show you." The deposition room went silent. Catherine stared at the paper I had placed on the table. It was the forged withdrawal form from 2009. Her name wasn't on it, but her fingerprints were all over the story. She recovered fast. Defense attorneys are trained to recover fast. She said, "This is not relevant to the case, Miss Cross, and I think you know that." I said, "It's relevant to your credibility, Catherine, and to your client's interests. Because if I'm going to spend the next 8 hours asking your client about documents he signed, I need to know that the woman sitting across from me understands what a forged signature actually means." The co-counsel leaned in and whispered something to her. Catherine's jaw tightened. She knew I had her, not legally, not yet, but morally. In that room, with the court reporter taking everything down, she knew the ground had shifted. I turned to the witness, a man named Harold Vance, 62 years old, former regional sales director for a company called Medcore Pharmaceuticals. He was accused of authorizing kickbacks to doctors who prescribed their drugs. The case was built on paper trails, emails, expense reports, internal memos. The kind of evidence that doesn't lie unless someone erased it first. I started with simple questions. His job title, his responsibilities, his reporting structure. Then I moved to the documents. I said, "Mr. Vance, I'm going to show you Exhibit 37. Do you recognize this email?" He looked at it, his face went pale. He said, "I don't remember sending that." I said, "But it has your signature block, your email address, your name." He said, "Someone could have used my computer." I said, "Interesting, because Exhibit 38 shows that same email was forwarded to your personal account 2 minutes after it was sent. Do you remember doing that?" He didn't answer. Catherine objected. She said the question was argumentative. The special master overruled her. I watched her face as he overruled her, and I saw something I recognized. Not fear, frustration. The frustration of someone who had always been able to control the room and suddenly couldn't. That was the moment I understood something important. Catherine had spent her entire life being protected from consequences. By our parents, by the system, by the sheer weight of never being the one who had to fight. She was a good attorney, but she had never been in a room where the person across the table had more evidence than she had charm. I kept going, 2 hours, 3 hours. I walked through every document, every timestamp, every red flag. Vance's story started cracking. He admitted he had approved bonuses tied to prescription quotas. He admitted he had coached sales reps on how to avoid detection. He admitted he had destroyed emails after receiving a legal hold notice. Catherine objected 27 times. 27, I counted. Each objection got weaker. Each time, the special master looked at her with less patience. By lunch, her confidence was gone. During the break, she asked to speak to me privately. We stood in the hallway, away from the court reporter, away from her client, away from everyone. She said, "Lena, what are you doing? This is my career. This is my client. You're trying to humiliate me." I said, "I'm not trying to humiliate you, Catherine. I'm doing my job. The same job I couldn't do because you took my place at Georgetown." She said, "That was Mom, not me. I didn't ask her to do that." I said, "You wrote her a thank you letter. I have it in my file." She went quiet, then she said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want the truth, and I want you to tell it." She said, "I can't. If I admit that, I lose my license. I lose everything." I said, "Then we have a problem, because I'm not going to stop." She walked back into the deposition room. The afternoon session was worse for her. I introduced the letter, the one where she thanked our mother for handling that thing with Georgetown. Catherine's client heard it. The co-counsel heard it. The special master heard it. Catherine requested a recess. Then she requested a private conference with the special master and opposing counsel. That was the first sign she was breaking. The special master agreed to a brief off-the-record discussion in the conference room. Just him, me, Catherine, and her co-counsel. No client. No court reporter. The room was small, windowless, with a cheap wooden table and 4 chairs. Catherine sat across from me. Her hands were shaking. She didn't look like the woman who had walked in that morning. She looked like the sister I remembered from childhood, the one who always got the last word because someone else had fought for it first. She said, "I didn't forge anything. I didn't ask Mom to forge anything. I was 17. I didn't even know what she did until after it was done." I said, "But you kept the benefit. You went to Georgetown, you graduated, you passed the bar, you never told the truth." She said, "Would it have changed anything? You would have still been denied. Georgetown wouldn't have admitted you retroactively." I said, "You don't know that, and you never gave me the chance to find out." The special master cleared his throat. He said, "Counsel, this is highly unusual. Are you suggesting that the defense attorney in this case was personally involved in educational fraud?" I said, "I'm suggesting that her credibility is compromised, and that the evidence I have, including the forged withdrawal form, the transcript alteration, and her own letter, should be disclosed to the court for evaluation of fitness to practice." Catherine's co-counsel stood up. He said, "This is a fishing expedition. There's no connection to the Vance case." I said, "The connection is that my sister's firm is representing a client accused of document fraud, and the lead attorney has a documented history of benefiting from document fraud. The jury will want to know that." The special master looked at Catherine. He said, "I'm going to recommend that the presiding judge be informed of this issue. I'm also going to recommend that your client be given the option to seek separate counsel pending investigation." Catherine's face went white. She said, "You can't do that. This is retaliation. This is personal." The special master said, "Everything in litigation is personal, counselor. The question is whether it's relevant, and I believe a reasonable person would find this relevant." He stood up. The meeting was over. I walked out of the conference room. Catherine followed me into the hallway. Her voice was low, strained, almost a whisper. She said, "You're destroying our family. Is that what you want?" I said, "Our family was already destroyed, Catherine. You just didn't notice because you were sitting at the center of it." She said, "Mom is sick. She has cancer. Did you know that?" I stopped walking. I didn't turn around. She said, "Stage 3, diagnosed 2 months ago. She wanted to tell you, she didn't know how." I stood there for a long moment. The hallway was empty except for the two of us. The air conditioning hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. I said, "Is that why you're telling me now? Because you need leverage?" She said, "No, I'm telling you because you deserve to know, and because I'm tired of carrying secrets that aren't mine to carry." I turned around. She was crying, not the controlled tears of someone trying to manipulate, the real kind, the kind that come when the walls finally fall. I said, "I'll think about it." I walked back to my office. I closed the door. I sat down at my desk, pulled out the file, and stared at the forged withdrawal form I had kept for 11 years. The signature looked like mine, close enough. My mother had practiced it. She had always been good at copying things. I thought about what Catherine had said. Mom has cancer, stage 3. I thought about the last time I had spoken to my mother. It was 3 years ago, a brief phone call on my birthday. She had asked if I was eating well. I had said yes. She had said she was proud of me. I had said thank you. We had hung up, that was it. 3 years of silence on both sides. I called my father. He answered on the first ring. He said, "Lena, hi, how are you?" I said, "Dad, is Mom sick?" He paused, then he said, "Who told you?" I said, "Catherine, is it true?" He said, "Yes, it's true. We didn't want to bother you with it. You seemed busy." I felt something crack inside me. Not anger, not sadness. A kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion of being protected from information that mattered. The exhaustion of being treated like a peripheral character in my own family's story. I said, "I'm not busy, Dad. I'm your daughter." He didn't answer. I hung up. I sat in the dark for a long time. Then I made a decision. The next morning, I called the presiding judge in the Vance case. I explained the situation with Catherine. I requested a status conference to discuss conflict of interest and potential disqualification. The judge scheduled it for the following week. I also called the Georgetown University Office of Admissions. I told them I had evidence of fraud in my 2009 application file. The woman on the phone said she would escalate it to the legal department. She asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint. I said yes. Then I called my mother. She answered on the fourth ring. Her voice was thin, tired, smaller than I remembered. She said, "Lena, is that you?" I said, "It's me, Mom. Catherine told me about the cancer." She said, "I didn't want you to worry." I said, "I know, but I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." She said, "What?" I said, "Did you forge my withdrawal letter to Georgetown in 2009? The line went quiet. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, "Yes." I closed my eyes. 11 years of wondering. 11 years of telling myself I might be wrong. 11 years of hoping the evidence I had found was some kind of mistake. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because Catherine wanted it more, and I thought she would do more with it." I said, "You thought wrong." She started crying. I didn't. I said, "I have to go, Mom. I'll call you again soon." I hung up. I sat in my office looking at the file, the forged withdrawal form, the transcript, the letter, the phone call. Then I opened my laptop and started writing the motion to disqualify Catherine Cross from the Vance case. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. I had 5 days to prepare, 5 days to decide how much of my family's history I was willing to expose in a federal courtroom, 5 days to figure out whether justice was the same thing as revenge. On Tuesday, Catherine called me. She said, "I'm withdrawing from the case. Voluntarily. I told my client I couldn't represent him effectively given the circumstances." I said, "That's probably smart." She said, "I'm also going to resign from my firm. I'm going to take a leave of absence and figure out what I actually want to do with my life." I said, "Are you telling me this so I'll drop the complaint?" She said, "No, I'm telling you because you're my sister and I owe you the truth. I've been living a lie for a decade. I don't want to do it anymore." I didn't say anything. She said, "I know you don't trust me. You probably never will. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." I said, "That's a long time." She said, "I know." I hung up. I looked at the motion I had written. It was 40 pages long, with exhibits, affidavits, and case law. It would have destroyed her career. It would have gotten her license suspended. It would have been the end of everything she had built. I saved the document. I closed my laptop. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. The next morning, I called the presiding judge's chambers. I withdrew the motion. I told the clerk that the conflict had been resolved. Then I called my mother again. I told her I was coming home for the weekend. She started crying again. This time, I let myself feel it. On Saturday, I drove to the house I had left 11 years ago. The same driveway, the same front door, the same kitchen table where my mother had forged my name. She was thinner than I remembered. Her hair was gone. She wore a scarf. She hugged me and held on longer than she ever had before. She said, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." I said, "I know." And for the first time in 11 years, I sat down at that table and ate dinner with my family. But I kept the file. I kept every document, because some truths don't go away just because you decide to move forward. Some truths are the foundation you build on. And I was just getting started. That weekend visit changed something, not everything, but enough. I watched my mother move through the house like a woman who had already made peace with the end. She cooked my favorite meal, lasagna, the same recipe she used when I was 10. She asked about my work. She didn't ask about the case. She didn't ask about Catherine. She didn't apologize again. Maybe she didn't know how. My father sat at the head of the table, quieter than usual. He kept looking at me like he wanted to say something and couldn't find the words. I knew that look. It was the same look he gave me the night I left for Chicago 11 years ago. The look of a man who had chosen silence so many times he no longer remembered how to speak. On Sunday morning, before I left, I found something I wasn't supposed to find. My mother was in the backyard, resting in a chair. I went to the basement to grab a box of old photos she had offered me. The file cabinet was still there, the same one where I had found the forged documents 6 years ago. It was locked now, but the key was in the top drawer, exactly where my father always kept it. I opened it. Inside was a folder I had never seen before, labeled Lena Insurance. I pulled it out. It was thick, heavy. Inside were documents I didn't expect, bank statements, email printouts, a recorded phone call transcript, and a handwritten letter from my father to my mother, dated 2010. The letter said, "We need to tell her the truth. This isn't right. Catherine knows. She's been quiet because you told her to be quiet. But if Lena ever finds out, she will never forgive us. And I don't think I could live with that." I read it 3 times. Then I read the bank statements. They showed a series of deposits from an account I didn't recognize into my mother's personal account. 12 payments, $50,000 total. The dates spanned from 2009 to 2012. The memo line on each deposit said, "Educational support." I checked the transcript of the phone call. It was dated March 15, 2009, the same week my acceptance was rescinded. 2 voices, my mother and a man I didn't recognize. The man said, "The admissions office will process the withdrawal as long as the documentation looks legitimate. We've done this before, don't worry." My mother said, "And the payment?" The man said, "Half now, half when she enrolls, standard arrangement." My mother said, "It's done." I closed the folder. My hands were shaking. I walked upstairs, out to the backyard, and stood in front of my mother. I said, "Who did you pay?" She looked at me, her face went pale. She said, "What are you talking about?" I held up the folder, the bank statements, the phone call. "Who did you pay to get Catherine into Georgetown?" She stared at me, then she started crying. Not the soft crying from the phone call, the kind that comes from a place too deep to hide. She said, "I didn't pay anyone to get Catherine in. I paid someone to keep you out." The words landed like a physical blow. She said there was a man. He worked in the admissions office. He had a side business. Families like ours, families who wanted something specific, they paid him to make it happen. I paid him to flag your file, to make sure the withdrawal went through, to make sure no one asked questions. I said, "You paid a stranger to destroy my future." She said, "I paid him to protect Catherine's future. She wasn't as strong as you, Lena. She needed the help. You were always going to make it. You were always going to be fine." I said, "I was not fine, Mom. I spent 6 years thinking I wasn't good enough. I spent 6 years believing I had done something wrong. You let me believe that." She didn't answer. I said, "Who else knows about this?" She said, "Your father, Catherine, the man, that's it." I said, "The man, what's his name?" She said, "I don't remember, it was 10 years ago." I said, "You don't remember the name of the man you paid $50,000? She said, "He used a pseudonym, I only met him once. He called himself Mr. Grant." I said, "You met him once?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Where?" She said, "At a hotel, in Arlington. He told me to bring the documents, I brought them. He looked at them, said they would work, and told me the rest would be handled. I never saw him again." I said, "Did you keep any proof of who he was? A business card, an email?" She said, "No, I was careful not to leave a trail." I looked down at the folder in my hands. Bank statements with an unknown account, a phone transcript with an unidentified voice, a pseudonym, a decade-old crime. I said, "You left a trail, Mom. You just didn't know it. I'm going to find him." She said, "Lena, don't, please, it's over. Let it be over." I said, "It's not over, it's just starting." I drove back to Washington that afternoon. I didn't stop for food. I didn't stop for rest. I drove straight to my office, pulled out the folder, and started making calls. The bank account was traced to a shell company registered in Delaware. The shell company had been dissolved in 2013. The registered agent was a law firm that had since closed. The phone number on the transcript was a prepaid cell phone that had been deactivated in 2010. But there was one detail that didn't fit. The phone call transcript mentioned something my mother hadn't told me. The man said, "We've done this before," not "I've done this before." We, plural. That meant he hadn't worked alone. There was a network. I called an investigator I trusted, a former FBI agent named Sarah Chen. She had worked the Varsity Blues case before retiring. I told her everything. Sarah listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "There's a pattern here I recognize. The shell company, the pseudonym, the prepaid phone. This wasn't a one-off. This was a service." I said, "A service?" She said, "There are brokers, middlemen. They connect parents with insiders at universities. Sometimes it's a coach, sometimes it's an admissions officer, sometimes it's a registrar. The Varsity Blues case caught the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole ecosystem underneath." I said, "How do I find them?" She said, "You don't, they find you, but you have something they don't expect. You have a phone transcript, you have bank records, and you have a motive. That's more than most people have." She paused, then she said, "But Lena, if you go after this, you have to understand something. The people who run these networks don't just lose clients when they get caught. They lose their freedom. They will fight back, and they have resources." I said, "So do I." She said, "You have a federal prosecutor's salary and a file folder. That's not the same thing." I said, "It's a start." Over the next 3 weeks, I built the case. I subpoenaed the bank records. I traced the shell company to a former Georgetown admissions employee named Raymond Cross, no relation, irony, pure coincidence. He had been fired in 2012 for unrelated misconduct. He was now living in Florida, working at a community college. I flew to Florida with a subpoena and a federal marshal's escort. Raymond Cross was 68, retired, living in a condo near the beach. He didn't expect me. He opened the door in a golf shirt and sandals. I showed him my badge. I said, "Mr. Cross, I need to ask you about a conversation you had with my mother in March of 2009. He looked at me like he had seen a ghost. He said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm the application you helped reject." He closed the door. I heard the lock click. I knocked again, no response. I called Sarah. She said, "He's going to lawyer up. You have about an hour before he calls someone. You need to get ahead of it." I didn't have an hour. I had a flight back to DC in 4 hours. I had a hearing the next morning, and I had a father who had been hiding the truth for 11 years. I called my father. He answered. I said, "Dad, I know everything. The bank account, the phone call, the man named Raymond Cross. I need you to tell me the rest." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother didn't do this alone, Lena. I helped. I set up the account. I made the transfers. I knew what she was doing and I let it happen. I closed my eyes. He said, I'm sorry, I should have stopped her. I should have told you I was a coward. I said, you were. I didn't say anything else. I hung up. I stared at the ocean from the rental car parking lot. The sun was setting. The water was calm. I thought about my sister, about my mother, about the man in the condo who had helped steal my future. And I thought about the one thing I hadn't told anyone yet, the reason I had kept the file for 11 years, the reason I had become a prosecutor, the reason I had taken the Vance case. I had known Catherine would be assigned to it. I had known her firm represented the defendant. I had known because I had checked. 3 years ago, when I applied to the U.S. Attorney's Office, I had asked specifically to be assigned to cases involving Medcore Pharmaceuticals. I had read their legal filings. I had seen Catherine's name on a previous motion. I had waited. This was never just about the truth. This was about the moment when the person who took everything from you has to sit across the table and watch you take it back. But now I had something bigger. I had a network, a conspiracy, a system that had stolen not just my spot but probably others, and I had the power to expose it. I drove back to the airport. I booked the earliest flight. I called Sarah and told her I was going to need a full investigation. She said, that's going to require resources and authorization. Are you sure you want to open that door? I said, I've been knocking on it for 11 years. It's time to walk through. The flight landed at midnight. I went straight to my office. I typed a memo to the head of the criminal division. Subject line, Systemic Admissions Fraud Investigation, Potential Multi-University Scope. I attached the bank records, the phone transcript, the deposition notes, the letter from my father, and the name Raymond Cross. I sent it at 2 in the morning. Then I leaned back in my chair and waited. The response came at 9 the next morning. The head of the criminal division wanted to meet in person. She brought 2 other attorneys. She closed the door. She said, this is bigger than a family dispute, Lena. If what you have is accurate, this involves a network that may have operated across multiple institutions. We're going to need to coordinate with the Department of Education, possibly the FBI. I said, I understand. She said, there's something else. Your sister's resignation from her firm, it's already public. The legal press is picking it up. They're asking questions about why she withdrew from the Vance case. They're going to find out about your connection. I said, let them. She said, this will be a media storm. Your family's name, your mother's health, your sister's career. Are you prepared for that? I said, I've been preparing for 11 years. She nodded. She said, then let's get to work. We opened a formal investigation. It was assigned a case number. I was named lead prosecutor. Sarah Chen was brought on as a consultant. Raymond Cross was served with a federal subpoena the next day. He hired a lawyer. His lawyer called my office and offered a deal. Full cooperation in exchange for immunity. I accepted. The next morning, I sat in a conference room with Raymond Cross, his lawyer, 2 FBI agents, and Sarah Chen. Cross looked smaller than he had on his doorstep. He was wearing a suit that didn't fit. He kept his hands folded on the table. He said, I want to make this right. I said, then start talking. And he did. He told us about the network, the system, the names, the payments, the universities, the families. He told us about the parents who paid to steal spots from children who had earned them. He told us about the administrators who looked the other way. He told us about the students who knew and stayed silent. He told us about my mother. And then he told us about something else, something that made the entire room go silent. He said the program didn't stop in 2009. It's still running. And it's bigger than Georgetown. It's at least a dozen schools. And the people running it, they're still out there. I looked at Sarah. She looked at me. I said, name them. He gave us 47 names in 2 hours. Some I recognized. Some I didn't. All of them were about to learn what happens when the evidence catches up. I walked out of that conference room with a list that would change everything. Not just for my family, for hundreds of families, for a system that had been rigged for decades. I called my sister. She answered. She said, "I heard you opened an investigation." I said, "Yes." She said, "It's going to destroy Mom." I said, "Mom destroyed herself. I'm just making sure the truth comes with her." She was quiet, then she said, "What about me?" I said, "You're going to have to live with what you did, Catherine. That's not my job to fix." She said, "I know." I said, "Good." I hung up, I looked at the list of names, and I picked up the phone to make the first call. This time, I wasn't asking for permission. I wasn't asking for understanding. I was starting the only case that ever mattered. I was starting the only case that ever mattered, and it wasn't just my case anymore. Over the next 6 months, the investigation expanded beyond anything I had imagined. Raymond Cross's testimony led to 12 more insiders. 12 men and women inside elite universities who had accepted payments to alter applications, fabricate credentials, and flag files for rejection. They had operated across Georgetown, Duke, Vanderbilt, USC, and 2 Ivy League schools. They had processed over 200 fraudulent admissions between 2005 and 2015. The total value of payments exceeded $4 million. Each name on that list led to another: parents who had paid, students who had known, administrators who had looked the other way. The network was a spiderweb, and Raymond Cross was the first thread I pulled. The FBI assigned a full task force. We executed search warrants on 3 homes, 2 offices, and a storage unit in Maryland that contained decades of records. We found handwritten ledgers, encrypted email accounts, burner phones, a safety deposit box with cash and bearer bonds. One ledger included a notation that stopped me cold. It listed my mother's name. Next to it was an amount, $50,000, and a code, GTLC09, Georgetown, Lana Cross 2009. They had coded me. I sat in the evidence room and stared at that entry for 10 minutes. I wasn't a victim to them. I was a transaction. By the end of the summer, 15 people had been indicted. 3 had pled guilty. Trials were scheduled for the following year. The media coverage was relentless. My name was in every headline. So was Catherine's, so was my mother's. My mother's health declined rapidly after the story broke. She stopped answering calls. She stopped leaving the house. My father called me once, asking if I would visit. I told him I couldn't, not yet. Catherine went into hiding. Her license to practice law was suspended pending review by the state bar. Her former firm issued a public statement saying they had been unaware of her involvement in any prior misconduct. No one believed them. I kept working. I testified before a grand jury. I sat through depositions. I reviewed thousands of pages of evidence. I built cases against people I had never met, people whose names I had only seen in ledgers, people who had stolen futures from hundreds of strangers. And then I found the name I wasn't looking for. It was buried in an email chain from 2011, a thread between Raymond Cross and an administrator at Duke. The subject line was, "Follow up on Holloway." Holloway, the name from Catherine's in-laws. Audrey Holloway. Her father was Judge Holloway, the same judge who, in the original story, had recognized the protagonist at the dinner table. I read the email 3 times. It said, "Regarding the Holloway matter, the father is aware. He has requested no further contact. He is not a participant, but he is not an obstacle. Proceed as planned." I didn't understand. I called Sarah. She said, "That's Judge Holloway, your sister's father-in-law, he knew." I said, "Knew what?" She said, "The email suggests he was aware of the admissions scheme. He didn't participate, but he didn't stop it either. He had influence. He chose not to use it." I thought about the dinner, about Judge Holloway recognizing me at the table, about the way he had looked at my mother. He had known who I was. He had known what my mother did, and he had said nothing. I tracked down Audrey Holloway. She was living in New York, divorced from Ethan, working at a nonprofit. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in D.C. She looked older, tired. She sat down across from me and said, "I've been waiting for this call." I said, "Did your father know about the admissions fraud?" She said, "Not at first, but he found out, after the wedding." Ethan told him during an argument, "My father confronted your mother, she confirmed it. He decided not to report it because it would have destroyed the family. He told me years later, I begged him to come forward. He said it was too late." I said, "Too late." She said, "He said the damage was done. Exposing it wouldn't undo what happened to you. It would only hurt more people." I said, "He was wrong." She said, "I know. I've been living with that guilt for 6 years." I asked her if she would testify. She said yes. That testimony became the final piece. Judge Holloway was never charged. He had no legal obligation to report a crime he didn't commit, but his reputation was damaged. He retired early. The Holloway family issued a public apology. I didn't accept it. My sister contacted me one last time. She was living in a small apartment in Richmond, working at a retail job. She asked me to meet her. I agreed. We sat on a bench in a park near the river. She looked thin, broken. She said, "I'm going to testify against Mom. I've already spoken to the prosecutor." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because it's the only honest thing I've ever done, and because I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror again." She started crying. I didn't. I watched the river. I said, "You should have done this 10 years ago." She said, "I know, I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are." We sat there for a long time without speaking. Then I left. The trial for my mother was scheduled for February. She was charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, identity theft, and obstruction of justice. She faced up to 20 years. Her health was fragile. Her lawyers argued she was too sick to stand trial. The judge denied the motion. I was listed as a witness. The prosecution asked me to testify about the documents I had found, the phone call, the confession. I agreed. On the morning of the trial, I walked into the courtroom. My mother was sitting at the defense table, thinner than the last time I had seen her, wearing a blue blazer that hung loose on her shoulders. My father sat behind her. He didn't look at me. I took the stand. I swore to tell the truth. I looked at my mother. The prosecutor asked, "Ms. Cross, can you describe the moment you discovered that your admission to Georgetown had been fraudulently withdrawn?" I told the story, every detail, the phone call to the registrar, the 12-hour drive, the file cabinet, the forged document, the letter from my sister. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. My mother was crying. The judge looked at her and said, "Do you have anything to say before the jury deliberates?" My mother stood up. She held the railing. She said, "I did what I thought was best for my family. I know it was wrong. I'm sorry." She looked at me. She said, "I'm so sorry, Lena." I didn't say anything. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned a guilty verdict on all counts. My mother was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. Her health was taken into consideration. She was assigned to a medical facility. She served 11 months and was released on compassionate grounds. She died 3 weeks later. I didn't attend the funeral. Catherine did. She called me afterward and told me our mother had asked about me in her final days. She said, "She wanted you to know she was proud of you." I said, "That doesn't change anything." Catherine said, "I know." We haven't spoken since. The investigation continued for another year. 23 people were convicted. Over 100 admissions were rescinded. Universities implemented new verification protocols. The Department of Education launched a nationwide review of admissions practices. I was promoted. I became the head of a new unit focused on educational fraud. I hired Sarah Chen. We trained other prosecutors. We built systems to detect forged documents, fabricated transcripts, and manipulated applications. I never took another case involving my family. But I kept the file, all of it, the forged withdrawal form, the bank statements, the phone transcript, the letter from my father, the ledger with my name coded in it. I kept it because I never wanted to forget. And because one day, someone else might need it. The final surprising detail came 6 months after the trial ended. I found a document I had overlooked. It was a single page, buried in the records from Raymond Cross's storage unit. A typewritten memo, dated 2008. It listed the criteria for clients who qualified for priority processing. The criteria included families with existing institutional relationships, families with political connections, families with legal representation. At the bottom of the page, handwritten in the margin, was a note. Cross-family, mother has access to legal resources. Father has accounting background. Daughter is non-threatening, approved. It was signed with an initial, not Raymond Cross, someone else. I never found out who wrote it. The initials were illegible. The memo was never linked to any specific person. It was a ghost. But it told me something I had always suspected. I wasn't chosen at random. My family was targeted because they were useful. My mother's access to a fax machine, my father's accounting skills, my sister's perceived need. And my own distance, my own quiet, my own absence. They saw us coming. But they didn't see me coming back. That was the part that mattered most. Because in the end, the network wasn't destroyed by a federal investigation. It was destroyed by a daughter who refused to stay quiet. And that's the truth I carry with me every day. And that's the truth I carry with me every day. Not the anger, not the verdict, not the headlines. The truth that silence is a weapon some families wield better than words. My mother spent her whole life believing she could control reality by controlling what people knew. She was wrong. Reality doesn't disappear when you hide it. It waits. And it has a way of finding the light. The system that stole my spot at Georgetown wasn't built by one broken person. It was built by a culture that teaches parents that their children's success is the only score that matters. That teaches families to measure worth by acceptance letters and job titles. That tells a mother it's okay to destroy one daughter's future so another can shine brighter. My mother believed that lie. She paid for it. So did my sister. So did I. But here's what I learned in the years since that deposition room. The people who stole my future thought they were protecting something precious. They were protecting a fantasy. A version of success built on borrowed ground. When that ground shifted, everything they built collapsed. Catherine lost her career. My mother lost her freedom and her health. Judge Holloway lost his reputation. I lost a family that was never really mine to begin with. And yet I gained something I didn't expect. I gained the knowledge that I could survive losing everything, that I could rebuild, that I could walk into a room where the person who wronged me sat across the table and still do my job with clarity and precision. That the same discipline that got me through law school at night would carry me through years of investigation. That justice is not the same as revenge, and that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. I still have the file. It sits in a fireproof safe in my office. I don't open it often. I don't need to. I know every page by heart. Forged signatures, bank ledgers, phone transcripts, letters written in guilt and received in silence. I keep it because it reminds me that facts are stubborn things. That evidence outlasts memory, that the truth, once written down, can never be unwritten. I don't know where my sister is now. I don't check. I made peace with the distance between us. Some bridges burn because they were built on rot. I don't wish her harm. I just don't carry her anymore. And if you're watching this, wondering whether your own story of being overlooked, denied, or erased will ever find its resolution, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need anyone to validate your pain. You don't need a courtroom to prove you were wronged. You don't need a confession to know the truth of your own life. What you need is to keep moving. Keep documenting. Keep building whatever case matters to you, not for revenge, for clarity. Because on the other side of that silence is a life you actually chose, and that is the only victory worth fighting for. Thanks for being here. If this story found you at the right time, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories about people who refuse to stay quiet. The truth always finds a way to surface. Sometimes it just needs a witness.